This presentation is an overview of social stratifications theory, specifically Karl Marx. We will be looking at some of the other stratification theorists in the next video. So when we're looking at Karl Marx, he has the idea that social conflict, struggle between segments of society over valued resources, and this social conflict, this struggle, has been part of the global interaction of human beings with each other since the very first surplus. So in his idea, hunters and gatherers did not have this type of social conflict. They were cooperative, they worked together. Once you started having the pastoral or horticultural societies, especially when you got into agricultural societies and the development of the feudal system, then you had this massive struggle between segments of society over resources. And in capitalism, for Karl Marx, there are two social classes. That's it, two segments: the capitalists, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, the people who sell their productive labor for wages. Now, when we think of capitalism, capitalists in Karl Marx's time, we are imagining factory owners. When we are thinking of capitalists in our time, we are thinking owners of multinational corporations, those on CEOs, board of directors of multinational corporations. We're not talking about the guy down the street who owns his own plumbing business. That is not the owners of the means of production. He is still selling his labor for wages, selling his productive labor for wages. Only when you can live off the productive labor of others can you be a capitalist. The other thing with Karl Marx is he has this idea of infrastructure and superstructure. So the infrastructure is society's economic system. It is capitalism, it is communism, it is socialism, it is feudalism, it is whatever the society's economic system is. For Karl Marx, everything, all other societal subsystems and institutions are organized to support that infrastructure. So family, religion, education systems, military industrial complexes, everything supports capitalism. The way our higher education is set up supports capitalism. The way we idealize families and stay-at-home moms and traditional families supports capitalism. Everything. Religions support capitalism. All of it does. And Marx rejected this false consciousness, this explanation of social problems as shortcomings of individuals. So instead of having, we are a highly individualistic society. So when somebody succeeds in our society, we think that they did it themselves. They succeeded all by themselves, against all the odds, pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, etc. Karl Marx says not necessarily. Or we think that if you fail by yourself. You pull yourself down by the bootstraps, whatever it is. It's an individualistic model of failure. And for Marx, he says, no, it's the flaws of society. The wage structure is too low. It's not that you are impoverished, it's the wage structure is too low. If the wage structures were higher, we would have fewer people in poverty. So he's looking at structural issues rather than individualistic issues. So we have young, cute Karl Marx up here because we always see the old fuzzy guy. So Marx believes that the history of all society is the history of class struggle or class conflict between entire classes over distribution. Those classes are going to be in the feudal system between the upper class elites, the lords, the kings, etc., and everybody else. In the capitalist system, it's the owners of the means of production against everybody else. And he believed that workers must replace false consciousness with class consciousness. You would recognize yourselves as a class united in opposition to the capitalist class and ultimately to capitalism, then rise up and destroy it. So there have been a few revolutions that have gone in the name of Marx. They've not necessarily followed his blueprint, which we'll talk about in a minute. But one of the biggest issues is getting everybody to agree with each other that we are two class systems. So this is a fun little figure. I've used it in the past to talk about Karl Marx. It's not specifically Marxism, but it's a good idea of how he views the world, that capitalism is on top, right? That's it. And then you have the ruling class, the elites, the owners of the means of production, those 8 guys. You don't have to be that much of a conspiracy theorist to say there's 12 people who make all the decisions. But, people like Bezos and Bill Gates and Elon Musk and those types, along with those types in London and those types that represent China and those types that represent Saudi Arabia and those types that, throughout the world, they know each other, right? They know each other, they have similar lifestyles, they communicate with each other, and they do a lot of lobbying and raising money for different law purposes, try to get things passed that benefit them. So they rule. They are the ones who rule. They are the oligarchy. They rule us. Marx had a really low opinion of religion. He felt that it could be used as a tool of manipulation. And that was his biggest fear about that. If you spend all of your time telling people your rewards will await you in heaven, you live a virtuous life now, the rewards await you in heaven. And he was like, now wait a minute. Why are you waiting for that? Can't you not have the rewards now? So he was not particularly a fan of religion. He felt that the educators, the religious people, and you could even throw entertainers and musicians and everything, the fooling class, the ones who fool us. And then who really owns the army? Who has control over that thing, that group that shoots at us? And then the bottom 2 classes. The false consciousness that he's talking about is really these people sitting at this table that have made it a lot of the way, but they are still not the owners of the means of production. They are fooled into this position believing that they are the elites, and they're not. They don't have the power that they think they do. And then everything is held up by the masses working at the factories, the masses working wherever it is that they're working. So it's just a quick little visual of kind of Karl Marx ideas of how the world works. Some other things that Karl Marx, we don't want to throw him out with the bathwater, even if his revolutions kind of fell prey to the idea that humans are a little more selfish than he gave them credit for. He kind of felt that if we overthrew the capitalist system, that those who were oppressed would never oppress others. And if you had to, for a brief period of time, put somebody in charge of realigning everything, then they would step back and allow this process to go on to the state of total communism. But we know that with some of those early Marxist revolutions, we now have this phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That divide stage, people who overthrew, we're going to talk about social problems in another video. And you've got to be really careful when you behead the king. What's coming next after you behead the king? Right now, Haiti is figuring that out. It's normlessness. It's not good. People will come in, they will take power, and they may or may not be better than the people who used to have power. But it doesn't necessarily mean that capitalism is still good. We still have to look at, he's still a good critic of capitalism. So he looks at the way that capitalism alienates workers. Alienation is that isolation and misery. Capitalism alienates us from the act of working. We don't have any say in what we do. Work is tedious, repetitive. We are no longer that guy making barrels all day with his family and a couple of apprentices, and when he makes his barrel, he sells his barrel, he's proud of his barrel, he profits from his barrel, all of that kind of stuff. Instead, we are on a production line doing a small thing, or we are working in fast food, doing exactly what they tell us to do. No say in production. Repetitive, tedious work. We are alienated from our products. We create products we do not profit from. Somebody else is profiting from them, and we merely get a wage. We get the wage that the economic system will support. We are alienated from other workers. If you start letting people have raises and such, and you start dividing up the workers, then they're never going to unite against you. So work is very competitive and not particularly cooperative. And then his biggest issue is this idea of denying your human potential. When you work all day as a barrel maker, you are still fulfilling your potential, according to Karl Marx, because he's assuming that if you're a barrel worker, you kind of like barrels. So this is what you want to do with your life. You would love to be a barrel worker and create these things. So your work is creative, your work fulfills that need within you to be creative. But if you are working on the production line, you are working 40, 50, 60 hours a week at something that does not fulfill you. And you have that 1 hour of, by the time you get home and you take, you have bathing time, sleeping time, eating time. By the time you get done with those things, you might have 20 minutes or so to fulfill yourself creatively. But Marx was hoping that the end product of overthrowing capitalism would be this state in which we could all do those things that we want to do. Like if you want to bake bread, you'll bake bread. And you also have to throw in here technology, because he also felt as though on these production lines that robots would take over. So we would not be drudgeries. We would not be working in this type of situation anymore. The robots would do all of this menial work, and then we could just do those things that fulfill us. We would be a non-capital system. We would not be a money system. It's not like bartering. It's not like, we would be kind of back to hunters and gatherers, a non-money, a whatever's next after capitalism system. So he was hoping that we would get to this point. So most people, in quick little review, most people have one of two relationships with the means of production. You are either the owner or the worker. The fancy French terms for this, and I cannot pronounce French very well, bourgeoisie and proletariat. So if you are the owners of the means of production, you are the bourgeoisie. If you are selling your labor for wages, you are the proletariat. I am the proletariat. I am sitting in a room talking at myself to a computer, and will eventually get paid for this labor. I actually named my little robot vacuum cleaner Letty because Letty labors while I rest. So Letty is also a member of the proletariat. Capitalism creates great inequality in power and wealth. That handful on top, that we rule you little piece on that previous slide, has a lot of power and a lot of money and a lot of wealth compared to everybody else, even those two layers on the bottom. And that he believed the oppression would drive the working majority to organize and overthrow. Now, why did we not have a Marxist revolution in the United States? Because who all had them? The Russian Revolution, Cambodian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, those are the closest to Marxist. You could throw Cuban in there, but those are the three closest that we have. But we didn't have a Marxist revolution here because the biggest thing is we had a labor movement. We had strikes, we had laws passed, we had labor laws passed that kind of took the edge off of unfettered capitalism. We fragmented our class system. We don't just have two, we have 9, depending on what textbook you're looking at. 9. We have a relatively higher standard of living that people don't want to put at risk. If you own a home and you have children in school, excuse me, you're not going to put that at risk to overthrow the capitalist system not knowing what's on the other side. We have worker organizations, that labor movement, the more extensive legal protections, that labor movement. That is the biggest reason why we don't have a Marxist revolution. We had government interference in capitalism. Now we have capitalist interference in government. So we're kind of going back the other direction. And who knows what we're going to have after we get through all of these times now. But we did not have the Marxist revolution in the 1800s, early 1900s, because of these organizations and legal protections. Things like a minimum wage. Things like, if you think about Carnegie and Carnegie Steel, if Carnegie decided he wanted to make more profit, he wanted a bigger house, whatever, and he was paying his workers 19 cents an hour and working them 10 hours a day, he could decide, I want to make a house. I want this house. I want it to be in Central Park. And it has to be better than the other rich guys. Has to be better than DuPont and some of those other guys that are out there. Rockefeller. So he could just decide, okay, guys, you guys are now working 12-hour days for 15 cents an hour. And you had no recourse if you were a worker. If you wanted that job, you had to do exactly what they told you to do. So we had the labor unions that eventually developed. There was bloodshed. There was hiring of personal armies by the different capitalist workers or capitalist owners of the means of production like Carnegie. They would hire Pinkertons. They would try to get the National Guard sent out to stop the strikes. But that's why we didn't. We kind of had that little mini revolution within the system against capitalism to provide more government regulations. And that is why we did not have the Marxist Revolution in the United States. But many of them have eroded, and we will be seeing what comes next. So that's all we have for this video. If I can find where I record and not record, and there'll be another one coming up.